Welcome to Islam and Christianity in Prophecy seminars. Today's topic is Islam and political chaos in prophecy. Jesus in John 14 said, "Let not your hearts be troubled." Why? Because he was going to heaven to prepare us a place so he could take us out of this crazy place and take us to heaven where it's much, much better. But while we're here, don't be troubled. He has a plan. Then down at verse 29, he says, "And now I have told you before it comes, that when it does come to pass, you may believe." Well, things are happening as predicted in prophecy, and people all over the world and from many different viewpoints are beginning to believe that we are in very troubled but very important times. Time to be ready to meet Jesus Christ. I'm going to give just a overview of our Daniel 11 materials. And you can get more at our website, islamandchristianity.org. There are resources there. There's a Daniel 11 commentary that goes verse by verse. And there you can get all the details. Here I'm only going to hit some of the high points. It would be many hours if I was to give the whole thing, and I want to give an overview for people to be able to look at. In Daniel 2, we have an image with different metals that started from Daniel's time, went all the way to God's kingdom. In Daniel 7, I call it God's cartoons. Daniel used animals. But we have Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and divided Rome, and the little horn up to the coming of Jesus Christ. Well, in Daniel's writings, these are all the powers that invade Israel and Jerusalem from the north. We have Babylon going up and then coming down from the north, and that in Jeremiah is explained as that they attack from the north. And then the Medes and the Persians, they follow the same route. They go up the Euphrates River and drop down from the north. And in Jeremiah 50 verse 9, it calls the Medes and the Persians an assembly of great nations from the north. And then the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great comes in from the north. And then you get the Greek Empire dividing 4 different ways. And of these 4 ways, Daniel focuses on 2 of them, the north and the south. They fight back and forth. And as you see here on the map, you see those arrows. The black one is the Seleucids, the blue one is the Ptolemies, and Jerusalem gets caught in the middle. You have the Roman Empire, and then they come in from the north. And so all these powers of Daniel 2, 7, 8, and 11 that are being talked about are coming in from the north. That makes them the kings of or from the north. It's not where their capital is based at. It is the direction of their invasion that counts. And they all invaded or occupied Israel from the north. And that brings us to the time of Jesus in Daniel 11:22. And we have a whole presentation that deals with that. Presentation 1 at our website, islamandchristianity.org. But friends, it is about Jesus. Jesus dies in the middle of this prophecy. God's people get caught in the middle. Jesus knows what it's like. And at the end, he rescues his people that are caught in the middle. So Daniel 11 is truly the story of how Jesus is with his people in the middle and rescues them. But then the Roman Empire breaks up, and again we have a king of the north and a king of the south. And the king of the north would be papal-led Christianity, and we have Islam to the south. And it is both literal and globally religious. The day of worship for Israel, the land of Israel, to this day, the primary day of worship is the 7th-day Sabbath. And there are people all over the world, both Christian and Jews, who worship on the 7th-day Sabbath. But the king of the north, papal-led Christianity, didn't want to be called Israelite or Jewish, so they changed the day of worship from Sabbath to Sunday. King of the south didn't want to be called Jewish or Israelite. They changed the day of worship from Sabbath to Friday. God's people all over the world are caught in the middle. Now, there are 3 conflicts. And Daniel 11:29 points them out. At the appointed time, he shall return and go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. The former one is the Crusades. The latter one is the time of the end, And the appointed time is the Ottoman Islamic Empire. And so we have 3 conflicts. Now, more on that in presentation 2 and 5 of our 10-part video. I'm giving these just so that I can give a brief overview, but you can go dig into the complete information online. Of these 3 conflicts, we have a chart here with them now. The first one, Arab Islam up through the Crusades. Then you have Ottoman Islam, number 2. And then in the time of the end, you have the 3rd and final conflict between papal-led Christianity and Islam and their allies. Let's take a look at what it says for this 3rd and final conflict. At the time of the end, so no question, we're looking at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. That would be Islam, and their allies would be attacking the king of the north, the papacy and their allies. And the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. He shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. I want you to notice, in this 3rd conflict, the king of the south goes down and does not come back. But when it's talking about the king of the south, it's talking about Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, Edom, Moab, and Ammon, which are western Jordan. When the king of the south goes down, it's naming territories that today are all in the Muslim sphere of influence. And somebody says, oh, what about Ethiopia? Yes, Ethiopia in Daniel's time includes what is now Somalia and Sudan, so that is overwhelmingly a Muslim area when you take it all into consideration, even to this day. So we have these 3 conflicts. The question is, who are the end-time allies of the papacy and Islam during this 3rd and final round? You'll find more on this one in presentation 3, the U.S. in Prophecy and the Time of the End Alliances, Political Left and Right in Prophecy. Now, briefly, these end-time allies. Revelation 13, we have a king of the north. The papacy gets a helper, which in presentation 3, we explained to be the United States and the Protestant world, which is basically those that are leaning more towards the political right. Whereas well, let's look at that part first. Brian Williams, back in December of 2021, he quit as a full-time broadcaster on television. And when he did, he said America is unrecognizable to what it used to be. In Revelation 13, that second power, called a beast with lamb-like horns, starts out lamb-like in a way, but it ends up speaking like a dragon. And if you pay attention, you know that the United States has been changing. And it's not a good change in recent years. So we are in this time period, it clearly seems to me anyway, we are in this time period of the change from lamb-like beast to speaking like a dragon. Then the king of the south, Islam, gets their allies from the radical left. And God's people will get caught in the middle. Remember, only Jesus is going to save you. And so if I offend you at this time, just remember I'm kind of an equal opportunity offender. I'm going to go after the left and the right because Satan has multiple tools to destroy different ones of us. We have in Revelation 11, we have a little blip there right under the number 2. That is the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. Then those teachings or the principles were kind of dormant for a little bit. And Karl Marx turns it to Marxist socialism. That takes over the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, China, and all the rest of it. And then around 1990, Ronald Reagan and the Pope both worked together to bring down communism and atheistic secularism. And it looked for a little bit like maybe it was going to be the end of it, But if you know history, they came back strongly. And what I'm going to be showing you is they come back with Islam. So here's what Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan did. This is from Time magazine in 1992. This was one of the great secret alliances of all time. Reagan and the Pope agreed to undertake a clandestine campaign to hasten the dissolution of the communist empire. Step by reluctant step, the Soviets and the communist government of Poland bowed to the moral, economic, and political pressure imposed by the Pope and the President. The Pope stood up against the communist government in Poland, and he supported the trade unions. And he encouraged his priests and churches to do the same. Ronald Reagan also supported those trade unions. Ronald Reagan did another thing. He pushed an arms race to try and financially bankrupt the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and so Ronald Reagan sent arms and weapons and training down to those mujahideen, the freedom fighters, radical Muslims in Afghanistan, and in the combined assault of the radical Muslims in Afghanistan, the President of the United States, and the Pope, the Soviet Union collapsed like a house of cards. That would be a wild card, because one of the guys trained to fight against the Soviet Union was a guy by the name of Osama bin Laden, who comes back to lead the attack against the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Now, some definitions you need to understand Daniel 11. The papacy. It is the government of the Catholic Church that is ruled by a pope who claims to have both geopolitical and global religious power, church and state. A caliph or caliphate is ruled by a caliph who claims both global and power and a global religious power. So he has geopolitical literal power and he has religious power. So that's church and state, or more accurately, mosque and state. King of the North, King of the South are just like each other, and they both want to control the whole world, and there's only room for one of these at a time. And every time we have a caliphate, we have a holy war. Now, Islamist. These are the radical Muslims who want to bring about a caliphate by force, and they want to establish this caliphate in the city of Al-Quds that you know as Jerusalem. So in Daniel 11, Jerusalem gets caught in the middle. Well, simple question. If the radical Muslims want to use Jerusalem, Al-Quds, as their worldwide capital, is there any chance that Jerusalem could get caught in the middle in this crazy conflict? Obviously there is. Who are Islamists? They would include the Muslim Brotherhood, which had its beginnings in the 1920s in Egypt, and all the rest of these radical groups have spun off of the Muslim Brotherhood since. Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State. Erdogan of Turkey is a great Muslim Brotherhood supporter. Iran and others. So these are the main Islamist groups out there. The moderate Muslims are those who are opposed to a caliphate by force in Jerusalem. These would include Saudi Arabia and all those who have signed the Abrahamic Accords with Israel. So far, United Arab Emirates, Sudan, Bahrain, Morocco, and Oman. And others are considering it, and Saudi Arabia is still considering doing this. In 2011, our book was published, Islam and Christianity and Prophecy. And when it was published, there was still a lot of this prophecy that was future. Now there's less that is future. But at that time, I said at some point, there's going to be radical Islam push against or anger the papacy. The papacy would call for war against radical Islam. The United States and its allies would become the enforcer for the papacy. Radical Islam would be overthrown. Moderate Islam would follow papal-led Christianity, and some Muslims would follow Jesus and the Bible. Those all began to happen in sequence in the summer of 2014. We're now going to go through that series of events. You'll notice that the stories, the news stories that I'm using, are in date order. You get to watch the whirlwind unfold. July 1, 2014, the Islamic State is formed. It is the first functioning caliphate since the Ottoman Empire. Actually, it was formed a day or two before, but it was reported on July 1. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-proclaimed leader of the Islamic State stretching across Iraq and Syria, has vowed to lead the conquest of Rome as he called on Muslims to immigrate to his new land to fight under its banner around the globe. I didn't realize that on day one it would be so clear that the king of the south, the Caliphate, is targeting a conquest of Rome. So we have the king of the south pushing on the king of the north. The question is, how long would it take the papal-led king of the north to call for holy war? They did in the Crusades. They did during the Ottomans. It was called the Holy League, if you want to look it up. How long would it take now? It only took 5.5 weeks. August 7, 2014, Pope Francis appealed to world leaders on Thursday to help end the crisis in northern Iraq after a sweeping advance by radical Islamic State militants forced thousands of residents of Iraq's biggest Christian town to flee their homes. His Holiness addressed an urgent appeal to the international community to take action to end the humanitarian tragedy now underway, and he was calling for military action. Well, how long would it take the United States to become the military enforcer? Less than 36 hours. The very next day, the President of the United States, President Obama, said America is coming to help. And within 36 hours, the United States struck the Islamic State for the very first time. So we now have the first 3 parts of that sequence coming into play. That should put us into this third and final conflict right here. So that got my attention very clearly back in 2014. We are now into the whirlwind conflict of Daniel 11. How long would it take? I can't tell you. There's no time prophecy. But both the first and the second conflict took centuries each. So my guess is this won't take centuries because this one is supposed to be like a whirlwind. The other ones weren't. So I can't tell you how long it is, but I don't think it's centuries. I think we don't have a lot of time left before God sets up his kingdom. Well, right after the United States starts attacking the Islamic State, Jihadi John, one of their people who actually was produced YouTubes and he cut people's heads off, including Daniel Pearl, for those YouTube videos, he calls Obama the dog of Rome. They also called the United States the dog of Rome. Why? Well, if the Pope calls for military action and the United States fights, that makes the United States the attack dog for Rome. Made all the sense in the world from their viewpoint, and I believe they were right prophetically that the United States at that point became an enforcer for the papacy. Then by the time we get to September of 2015, Pope Francis wants to be president of the world. This is from the Huffington Post. And it says, but shrewdly, methodically, and with a showman's flair, the soft-spoken 78-year-old Argentinian Jesuit priest named Pope Francis showed Thursday that he is running to become president of the planet. Here is a secular online magazine ready to endorse the Pope as president of the world, of the planet. Well, you see, the event happening at this time, the Pope went to the United Nations. Putin was there, Obama was there, but the Pope gets the press coverage, which indicates he is the primary leader that the people of the world turn to. Get this, at the time of the Crusades, the world followed the papacy because they were afraid of a radical form of Islam. At the time of the Ottoman Empire, at the Holy League, the world, their world and the European world followed them because they were afraid of a violent form of Islam. Why would the whole world follow them at the time of the end, according to Revelation 13:3? It says the whole world follows, but why? Well, it would be, once again, the third conflict with Islam because of fear of a violent form of Islam. And we're now into that conflict. By the time we get to October 2019, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed. What's next? They put a new caliph in. Just as in the past, you have one caliph after another in the Caliphate. He was killed in February of 2022. Does that mean the king of the south's finished? No. They put another one in place. But more likely is the king of the south expands. We have Iran. We have other groups as well. Erdogan is president of Turkey. He wants to establish the caliphate. Well, Iran, they want to reestablish the caliphate as well. Let's take a look a little bit here. This is a poster that they put out. These ships that are burning are all flying either Israeli or American flags. And so Iran was just saying we drowned them all. And at this time period, they were attacking quite a few ships, and they're always threatening to attack ships out in the Persian Gulf and in other places. But notice, in the distance, the focal point of where you're headed to is what? It's the Dome of the Rock up on the Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem, which is Al-Quds, which is where they say they're going to set up their capital. As a matter of fact, they say that their military special forces that are trained to fight outside of Iran are called the Al-Quds Brigade. And so with the Al-Quds Brigade, we have, in other words, they're named the Jerusalem Force. That's the focal point. But look at the water. That water is a Palestinian headscarf. A Palestinian headscarf. Oh, what's that have to do with anything? Iran is Shiite Muslim. The Palestinians are mostly Sunni Muslim, but they are supporting the Palestinians because they both want to get Jerusalem, because that is where they expect to set up the worldwide headquarters, the capital of the Muslim Caliphate, and force all the world to be Muslim. And so their pictures actually show you what they're doing. And then in January 2020, this was an interesting, these are headlines from the Drudge Report. At that moment, Iranian missiles were raining down on U.S. troops. And they said, it's war. Each one of these phrases is a headline from some newspaper around the world, or publication from around the world. And at that moment, they said it's war because they thought the United States and Iran had just gone to war. Here's why. The United States had, President Trump had ordered the killing of Soleimani, the commander of the Al-Quds forces of Iran. He was killed in a drone strike just a couple of days before the 7th. And now Iran was striking back with Operation Martyr Soleimani. And President Trump had said if one American dies in a counterattack, that Reagan had already designated 58 targets, one for each of the hostages of the Jimmy Carter years in Iran. And those targets included military, cultural, and religious sites. In other words, Trump was ready to go into holy war fashion in response if any Americans died. Well, Iran tried to kill Americans. They sent a bunch of missiles into American bases in Syria and Iraq, but nobody died. 50 to 100 Americans did get concussions, but nobody died, and Trump held his fire, and we did not go to war, as the headline said. But that's just to let you know how close it already came to blowing out what could have become a world war in 2020. The Muslims hadn't backed off, though. A few days later, we have a Muslim preacher at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and he's saying Jerusalem will soon be the capital of a global caliphate. Siam can be seen telling the enthusiastic crowd that 3 prophecies would soon be fulfilled, that the rightly guided caliphate will be established, that Jerusalem will be liberated and established as its capital, and that Islam would achieve world domination. Caliphate takes over, king of the south. Jerusalem, Al-Quds, becomes the capital, and they dominate the world. Anybody who's not a Muslim would then be killed. That's what they're still saying. That's what they believe. Jerusalem will be caught in the middle, just like Daniel 11 says. Then COVID came on the scene. And the threat of radical Islam disappeared, right? Or does it? Yeah, it really didn't go away. And they just continued. Biden won the election then in 2020. And radical Islam is emboldened, and Iran is emboldened because they think that they will be able to get away with things. Meanwhile, the conflict hasn't gone away because Iran is really trying to increase its sphere of influence. Senator Lindsey Graham warned All Israel News that the Israeli Defense Forces may have to launch a preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear facilities because Iran says they're going to wipe Israel off the face of the map so they can get Jerusalem. Well, that means Israel has to take out their abilities to do so. And if Iran's developing nuclear technology, Israel has said they will take it out. And they're serious about it. And they are currently training for that event. By the time we hit later into the year 2020, in the first 200 days, Nigeria had a death count of over 3,462 Christians killed in the first 200 days. These are killed by Muslims. Why is that number special? Normally in Nigeria, you have 2,000 to 3,000 Christians killed every year, but in 200 days, they were already well over that number with 3,462. I'm just here to show you that the threat of radical Islam has not gone away, even though it's not nearly as noted by the media anymore. When we hit August of 2021, the Taliban took back over Afghanistan, and it emboldened China and radical Islam and the radical left. And the Taliban's 20-year victorious alliance with China against the U.S. and the Uyghurs. Now, that's interesting. So for 20 years, China's been assisting the Afghanistan powers, the Taliban. And now that means Taliban and China are working together. And interestingly, just recently it came out that the Taliban stopped blowing up Buddha statues because they don't want to tick off China. Again, we'll be coming back to this, but radical Islam and the radical left are working together. And we had an 11-day conflict in May of 2021 between Israel and Hamas, and something very interesting happened. Radical Muslims sided with the Palestinians. Moderate Muslims, in particular, the Abrahamic Accords nations, sided with Israel. Meanwhile, the radical left across the world, not just in the United States, but including the United States, the radical left supported the Palestinians, and the moderate left supported Israel. Here's what's interesting. Radical Islam goes down in Daniel 11. Moderate Islam follows papal-led Christianity, and some follow Jesus in the Bible. And we're watching that happen. Back when Soleimani was killed, the radical left and radical Muslims were all upset. The moderate left and moderate Muslims were quietly happy. The breakdown of who supports who is consistent time after time with the radical left and radical Islam agreeing with each other. Now, let me just cover this briefly. Both the radical left and radical Islam dislike Israel. Both of them dislike capitalism. Both of them dislike traditional Christianity. They both dislike American exceptionalism. You go to a street demonstration, one says death with America, the other one says down with America. They both hate conservative politicians. They both like social justice. They use it all the time, but there's some glaring exceptions. And they both think that Jesus is just a good man, but not God. And the Bible is not really the authority. Amazing list of similarities, and I'll pack that in another video. But eventually, whenever the king of the South, Islam, or the radical left gain control, you have persecution. You can read publications like The Voice of the Martyrs, and you will find out how they're both persecuting people of faith that are truly following Jesus in the Bible. But in 2021, the most dangerous country to live in for a Christian was Afghanistan, which is radical Islam. The second most dangerous country that had been the most dangerous for several years previous was North Korea. Radical left, Marxist socialism. Interesting. Over and over they're the same. But I can take you back further in history and find that whenever the king of the North has full control, politically and religiously. They persecute as well, as in the Inquisitions and things like that. So we have both radical Islam and the radical left pushing back together at the moment as allies. There's a time pressure building because they're not that strong. And what they're doing is they are angering traditional-led Christianity, traditional papal-led Christianity. And that time pressure is building upon them. There are elections coming up that they may or may not win. The longer they're in power, the more enemies they get. And it's interesting to watch. As they have that time pressure, they tend to overreach, and it creates a greater backlash. And the king of the south and radical left will go down, my belief here, based on these prophecies of Revelation 11 and Daniel 11. And then the king of the north comes roaring in, and they become very dangerous as well. So, king of the north overthrows radical Islam and the radical left. Moderate Islam follows the king of the north, and moderate left follows the king of the north. But some from the left and some from Islam follow Jesus in the Bible, and some out of the king of the north also follow Jesus in the Bible. There will be a group of people who come together to follow Jesus in the Bible, and that's where you want to be. And when you're there, you will get caught in the middle. So which is the most dangerous? The king of the north, the king of the south, the left, or the right? Well, if you're looking at Islam, the king of the south, if you grow up in a culture that is Islamic, it's more likely to deceive you. If you grow up in a part of the world that is Christian culture, the king of the north will be more attractive and more likely to deceive you. As far as the political left and the right, whichever one you lean towards is the one that is most likely to deceive you. So you have if you lean left, it's more dangerous because you see the problems of the right, but you don't see your own problems. If you lean right, you see the problems of the left, but you don't see your own problems. You know, in your own house. We call it nose blind. You don't smell the stinks of your own house. You smell it when you walk into somebody else's. And so I just want to warn each and every one of you. The one you're more comfortable with, the one you lean towards, is the one most dangerous as far as deceiving you, with one little caveat. Whichever one is in power is the most dangerous for everybody at the moment. Right now, in much of the Western world, the left is in power. But that time may well be limited, and the right comes swinging back in, and at which point they become more dangerous once they're in power. Now let's take a look at the text and see how this plays out. But news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. Edom, Moab, and Ammon are the people that escape. And you look at the map, it's from the east. But out of the north, out of papal-led Christianity, Revelation says God calls, in Revelation 18, he calls out his people from there too. And they come together to share a final warning message to the world. And it gets the king of the north mad, papal-led Christianity, and they go out to destroy and annihilate God's people who are caught in the middle. And you have this remnant of Muslims that are joining. Now, catch this text. Joel 2:28, and it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And all over the Muslim world, we have people that are having dreams and visions of Isa, Jesus, the man in white. And he's telling them to trust in him as their Savior, and the Bible is their authority for life. 2/3 of Muslims who've become followers of Jesus have a dream or a vision leading them to do so. It's very exciting to be living in this time. In Daniel 11, things are being fulfilled. Joel 2, just before the coming of the day of the Lord, you're supposed to have all this dream and vision activity, and it's happening by the hundreds of thousands all over the world right now. It appears to me that God himself is putting on the pressure. It's getting time for him to rescue his people. And so when I look at the chart, we have the third conflict with Islam beginning. Papal-led Christianity and Islam are in conflict. The political right, traditional Christianity, is joining with the king of the north. Radical left is joining with the radical Muslims of the king of the south. They go down. We have the last little warning message. And then the king of the north himself will go down as Jesus sets up his kingdom. Now, we currently have some alliances. Russia, invading the Ukraine, made some interesting alliances visible. Who is it that supported Russia? Didn't want to criticize them? China, North Korea, Iran, and Syria. Note, these are radical left, atheistic, secular, Marxist, socialist countries or radical Muslim countries. On the other hand, you have the secular West. These are your Great Reset supporter kind of things. These are international control people. But you also have another group, papal-led Christianity. I would say if a pope like Bishop Vigano comes into play, the king of the north would very quickly become more traditional in its Christian form and control. And so you have an international religious group striving for control. So you have these different players all trying for control, and based on prophecy, I'm going to say that some form of papal-led Christianity is the one that's going to come out on top, and he's going to be sucking in with him some of the Muslims and some of those from the political left to go along with it. You notice it says, never waste a crisis. Right now we have environmental issues, we've had COVID, we have Ukraine, oil, food, economy, all this stuff up. We have crisis. And all these groups listed at the top of the page are wanting to take advantage of it. And in case you haven't thought about this, that food crisis and economy crisis is huge. Coming out of this conflict with Russia and the Ukraine, food in the Middle East can create a very volatile Middle East because they get most of their food out of Ukraine with a bunch out of Russia, and both of them are in trouble. And so food is already an issue in the Middle East. And when food is an issue, it becomes more volatile. And the finishing touches of Daniel 11 could be just around the corner. In Daniel 12, verses 1 through 3, we have Michael standing up in a time of trouble like there never was, followed by deliverance and resurrection, and spending eternity with God. You can watch all of those materials at our islamandchristianity.org website. Again, I want you to compare what we say to Scripture. Then, if it's true, share it with other people. And if you would like, you can invite me to your church or event, and I'll go to any church of any denomination. I'll come to a mosque. I will go anywhere to share God's word, or any event. And God be with you as you study. God said that he would send his Spirit to lead and guide us in the truth. You'll find that in John 16. And I pray that the Holy Spirit will lead you into truth. God bless, and I hope to hear from you.